I'm Mo. It is December 9th, and I have finished my first book in December, and that means it's time for another vlog-style monthly reading wrap-up. So here we go. A few days ago, I finished And Then There Were None by Agatha Christie. I read this book on audio, and I read it as part of the Christie's Missing Readathon. I have a few vlogs that tell more in detail my thoughts, and there is a spoiler vlog included in there as well. You can check that out in the description box below. This is one of Agatha Christie's most well-known novel. It's a standalone novel. It doesn't feature any of her main detectives, or actually really any detective at all. It is very, very short. It's only 170 some pages, so it would be considered a novella. It is about 10 people who are brought to an island, all under different pretenses, and when they get there, they realize that the real reason for their being there is different than any of them thought. They are all made to think about and own up to crimes that they may or may not have committed. Soon they realize that their mysterious host not only knows about these crimes in their past, but is planning on gaining justice for them in one way or another. This is the highest body count mystery novel I think I've ever read, and this is definitely the highest body count Christie novel I ever read. Once kind of chaos ensues and people start dying, they don't stop dying. There's a lot of death in this one. There's a lot of clues and misdirection, and it's a really fun little novel. I do think that with 10 characters, many of them being men, they're a little bit confusing. They kind of are all a little bit similar. Their voices are a little bit similar, so it's hard to distinguish them. But I think the main point of this book is not so much the individual people, but that all people are capable of committing crimes, and that there is a sort of moral justice and moral imperative in uncovering these crimes. Obviously, our murderer is going further than that. There's a little bit of commentary about that as well. Can you murder someone, or can you kill someone for a crime that they've committed? Is that just not another crime? I think the characters in this did get a little muddled. That could be because I was listening to it on audio. Although the reader was trying to do different voices, some of them sometimes got a little confused. Maybe it was just that this novel is so brief and that the main point of the novel is not the characterization, but the crimes. And I also think that this novel is a little bit about inventive crimes and how that's used. There's a nursery rhyme in this book. It's obviously a device to be clever and to show clever things, which, you know, is not bad. This book was definitely very controversial because it had several other different names before it had this one that were very inappropriate. So it was nice to see that in the audiobook they were changed to less inappropriate things. I actually never checked this copy. No, so this copy actually still has some of the inappropriate language. And of course, being a novel written in 1940, this has a lot of inappropriate stuff in it anyway. The device of the nursery rhyme and really exposing how clever these crimes were, or how different crimes are committed. Maybe they weren't all clever, but maybe they were committed in such a way that they were not able to be brought to justice in a lot of respects. I think that is more of the commentary. Like, I think that's an interesting idea that Christie is exploring, that crimes are committed all the time and very few people are held accountable for them. The insipid nature of some crimes were more of kind of the forefront. It's all about murder, but cozy mysteries are all about murder. It was definitely like cozy and fun, and I was really glad to read such a classic novel. It made me feel in my comfort zone to be back reading mysteries. I really enjoyed this novel. I'm glad to have read it. I'm happy to be reading a lot of mysteries in December, and when I read some more, I will get back to you. It is December 12th, and I have finished another book in December. I finished Unnatural Death by Dorothy L. Sayers. This is the first Dorothy L. Sayers that I have ever read, and she is considered a contemporary of Agatha Christie and a queen of crime and one of the classic mystery writers. This follows Lord Peter Wimsey. It's the third in the Lord Peter Wimsey novels. He is an aristocrat who kind of was lost as to what to do, and then he discovers that he has a knack for solving crime. In this, the third book, he is at a dinner table with his semi-partner who is a police detective from Scotland Yard. They are having a conversation about Lord Peter Wimsey writing a book on how death and murders can be accomplished without anyone ever knowing that they were. And someone at the next table overhears them. It happens to be a doctor who is pretty sure that one of his patients was murdered, but he couldn't find any cause and he couldn't ever prove it, and it kind of like ruined his life for a time. He starts to talk to Lord Peter and Detective Parker. Peter gets totally wrapped up in this case and he decides that he needs to solve it. This case happened several years ago, so it's a little bit of a cold case. The more that they become entangled in this case and the more that they learn about it, the more things start happening that make it look more and more like this actually was a murder, and now someone's trying very hard to cover those things up. I loved this book. It's a little bit long. I definitely think that this was a little bit more style than substance in a lot of ways. I think it's incredibly stylistic, and the way that Dorothy L. Sayers writes is very funny. Lord Peter is very irreverent, and he makes a lot of references to other mystery novels and other mystery writers. He makes a lot of reference to Sherlock Holmes, and he talks about Wilkie Collins at one point. I think this is very much like Dorothy L. Sayers knows what she's writing and knows what she's doing, and she's having fun with it. This book was very funny. I think it's interesting that this book and a book that I read earlier this year, the Lake District Murders, they were written right around the same time, but they're very different books. I think they were written maybe like 10 years apart or within 10 years. And that one is very kind of slow and plodding and all about kind of morality, and the detective in that is a family man, whereas this is all kind of about silliness and camp and how Peter is not necessarily a super moral person, but he does try to make the right moral decisions. And ultimately he wants to solve the cases, so he solves the cases. The partnership between Parker and Lord Peter Wimsey is an interesting one. They're very playful together. They kind of jest each other a lot. Parker's funny because he doesn't take any like guff from Lord Peter Wimsey. Obviously, Lord Peter is wealthy and a nobleman and has a certain amount of, status, whereas Parker is just kind of like an everyday policeman kind of guy. But they feel very equal in a lot of ways, which is kind of a nice partnership, and they're able to kind of make fun of each other and poke fun at each other. This book also, I'm pretty sure, had 2 lesbian relationships in it, which is interesting because they were definitely alluded to, but not necessarily outrightly said. So I'm interested to see if Dorothy L. Sayers' writing has any more kind of queer references in it. The first murder victim is referenced to live her life with her dear, dear friend, and it's very common for there to be like old spinsters and 2 women to live together in the late 1800s, early 1900s in the past, and not have a sexual connotation or not be in a sexual relationship. But the way that Dorothy Sayers writes it, it definitely seems like she knows it's a queer relationship, and she's telling you it's a queer relationship without telling you it's a queer relationship. And I feel like the same thing happens with another relationship later in the book that kind of mimics that. I don't know. I think everybody's gay. So maybe it's just me and I'm just like, I have like the wrong kind of gaydar where I just see gay in everything, and maybe that's not true at all, but I'd be interested to see if other people read that. It's very small and it's not like notable even necessarily, except when you're queer and you're looking for queer reference. So I really enjoyed this one, and I definitely look forward to reading some more Dorothy L. Sayers. It is December 19th, and yesterday I finished Dead Man's Float by Beth Sherman. This is the first in the Jersey Shore cozy mystery series, and I read the third one earlier this year, and then I went online and purchased the first two used. This follows Anne Hardaway, who has lived in the town of Oceanside Heights her whole life, and she's beginning to wonder if maybe she needs a change. When her high school crush, who left the town under dark circumstances, returns, she's excited to connect with him in a way that she never has before. When they get to hang out, she finds out that people in the town have been really cruel to him, convicting him in their own minds of a crime that he was never charged with, but everyone assumes that he committed. She finds out that townspeople have been calling him names or spitting on him, and worse still, someone sent him a death threat. She tries to tell him that the town is not as bad as it seems and its bark is worse than its bite, but he pleads her to help him find out who sent the threat to him. She demurs and tells him that they'll see each other the next day, but the next morning she wakes up and he has been found drowned on the beach. She finds it hard to believe that this is a coincidence, and when his brother shows up, he also worries that this was foul play, and they start investigating the crime together. These books are very cozy, very simple, very silly mysteries. I like that they take place in Oceanside Heights, which is actually Ocean Grove, New Jersey, which is the town next to the town where I live. I like hearing about things that actually existed there in the past and what Asbury Park was like in the past in some realistic ways, and I like hearing about them in a fictionalized, glamorized way as well. This book was super easy to clock who done it, and I don't think it was the kind of book that had the right clues that you could know that, but it was pretty obvious who the murderer was from the first few pages. These are a fun, sweet, cozy mystery series, so I don't mind knowing who the murderer was. I like that these books have a lot to do with the ocean. They're very descriptive about the waves and the water and the sky and the weather, and that almost plays a role in these books in a very minor way. The changing weather and tides is almost like a character in these books, and they're used not only as metaphor or foreshadowing, but just to give the vibe that the author is trying to accomplish, which I think these books do very well. I will definitely be continuing with the second in the series since I already own that one, and then after that I'll probably just wait to see if they come my way, but I was happy to have read this one. I don't know if this book is really going to make you feel a lot, but it is a good time filler, space filler. It is a fun, easy to read, fast-paced book that is super enjoyable. And I'll catch up with you when I read some more in December. It is December 23rd, and I finished one more book in December. This book was called Dark as a Hazel Eye, Poems About Coffee and Chocolate. This was a book that someone left at my work. I don't have a copy of it. I left it there. I read it in one afternoon. It's supposedly like 120 pages, but all the poems together probably only add up to about 80 pages. I just read the poems. I didn't read anything else. They're all poems by different authors, and they're all poems that have to do with coffee and chocolate. Some of them were good, some of them were bad. It was a very small press, and it's obviously a very obscure collection. I didn't love any of them, and I would never seek out poems about coffee and chocolate, but since it was at my work and since I had a little downtime, I was happy to have picked it up. It didn't really make me feel much, except reading in my coffee shop definitely makes me feel comfortable and cozy. It makes me think of all the coffee shops and in all of my life that I've read in, both as a worker and as a patron, and it was just a fun, quick little read. There was one little line I really liked, and it was something about the gurgling of the coffee pot being like the warbling of frogs or something like that, and that one really stuck out in my mind and I enjoyed that. There was also a collection of haikus, and I do enjoy haikus. Those two things, not the entire poem, but that little part of the poem, and then those haikus were probably my favorite out of the collection. Definitely a fun book, especially if someone is just getting into poetry. There was a lot of different styles, a lot of different methods of making poetry in this, so maybe for a young person who likes both coffee and poetry or is trying to get into coffee and poetry, this might be a good collection to get. Overall, for me, not that noteworthy. It is December 26th, and I finished one more book. In December. I finished Well Met by Jen Deluca. This is a contemporary romance written in 2019 about a young lady whose life in Boston has kind of fallen apart. She's broken up with her boyfriend. She has quit her jobs. At about the same time, her sister gets into a car accident and needs help recovering. So our main character, Emily, goes down to Virginia to help her sister. While she's helping her sister, she is also helping her niece, who is navigating high school, and one of the things that her niece really wants to do is join the high school Ren Fair. The Ren Fair is kind of renowned throughout the state, but one of the stipulations is that younger participants need an adult to help out. So Emily is roped into joining the Ren Fair as well. Since she is new in town and doesn't have many friends, she is lucky enough to find a few people that become her good friends, and also a few people who become possible love interests for her. The Ren Fair does not go how Emily thought it would. She ends up really enjoying herself, making some close connections, and falling in love. This year, in 2021, is the year of reading contemporary books. I probably haven't read a contemporary book for, I don't know, 10 years before this. I don't think I read any contemporary books since starting my booktube channel in 2020, but I wanted to try a lot of different things in 2021, and one of the things that booktube inspires is picking up books that you hear people talk about that they really enjoyed, and one of those books was Well Met. I was excited to see this in a free little library, and I was excited to get to it in December for the Christie's Missing Readathon under the prompt of a romance. Really love Ren Fairs. I used to go to the Ren Fair as a kid, and I loved the idea of transporting yourself into a magical world, a world that was different than your own, that had different rules. I loved the idea of getting dressed up. I loved the idea of being a different character or person while you were there, and getting to experience that magical world in a magical way. There was also a fairy world that we always used to go to every year too. That was during like May. It was a May fair, and you could dress up and be a fairy, and so I loved anything like that. Although Ren Fairs are rooted in reality and the fairy world was rooted in unreality, it was just a fun time to be someone else. I really liked the Ren Fair aspects of this book. I liked the feeling that it evoked of nostalgia and being back in my childhood and being able to become a different person when you wanted to for as long as you wanted to. If you wanted to get really into character and become a wench, you could, or a princess or a handmaiden or whatever it was, you could do that. I really liked that feeling of changing your perspective and opening your potential to be whoever you wanted. I also really liked that this was a very sweet romance. I think the romances that I like are quite sweet and nice. Maybe they have a little bit of steam to them if we're lucky. This one was hate to love or an enemies to lover, but it was just generally very like sweet and nice. I do think it suffered from something that I think all the contemporary romances that I've read suffer from, which is forced repetition. They really bang you over the head with the same concepts over and over again. They're not subtle. The contemporary romances that I've read have not allowed you to understand the characters through your connection with them as much as they have forced you to make those connections by saying the same thing over and over again. Definitely there was some missing communication tropes in this, or uncommunication tropes, which again is very common in contemporary romances. The uncommunication of not just asking what you want and not just saying what you want or asking the question that you need to ask is definitely hammered over your head in this book, which those parts I don't love about contemporary romances. I also think that the contemporary romances that I've read, and this one is included in that, are a little bit too long. Maybe it's because they're saying the same things over and over again, and so those things could have been edited out a little bit better and made the book flow a little bit smoother and been a little bit shorter. But this was a quick, fun read, and I'm super glad to have read it. I definitely want to read the 3 sequels to this. Overall, I really liked it, and this was the 5th or 6th book that I read this month. It is January, and I've gotten quite far behind with catching you up on the books that I read in December. So let's try to wrap it up here. The next book that I finished in December was Dracula by Bram Stoker. This is a classic gothic horror, but I also used it as a mystery for the Cloak and Dagger Christmas. It is a reread for me, but it also was a mystery to me because I couldn't remember what happened. I have so much pop culture osmosis floating around in my brain that I couldn't remember the actual story of Dracula, so I was super happy to reread it. This is an epistolary novel, so it's all told in journal entries and letters and correspondence about a young man, Jonathan Harker. He's a lawyer and a solicitor, and he goes to Transylvania to help Count Dracula make a land deal in England. While he's there, some very suspicious things start happening, and then he goes missing. Just after he goes missing, we're also looking from the perspective of his fiance and her best friend. Mina and her best friend Lucy are traveling companions. They're kind of hoping that Jonathan will turn up and come home, and Lucy's really excited because she has a bunch of suitors and she's finally going to get proposed to. Since Jonathan and Mina are already engaged, Mina is both happy for her friend and sad for herself that she doesn't know where her fiance is. Very strange event of a boat washing up on the shore with all its occupants dead occurs, and after that, things for Mina and Lucy become even more strange and bizarre. Lucy's suitors enlist the help of an occult specialist, and things take off from there. Since all these events seemingly lead back to Count Dracula, we must assume that he is also mixed up in these occult circumstances. Eventually, people come together, storylines are reunited, there's tragedy, there's love, there's adventure, there's thrills, there's chills, and of course, there's vampires. This is the classic story that pretty much everyone has heard of in some respect or another, and it definitely didn't disappoint. It's a great story, it's fun, it's compelling, it's fast-paced. Even though it's very slow in a lot of places, I think ultimately it's fast-paced and interesting. And this book brings up a lot of interesting topics and feelings of brotherly love, humane love, people becoming part of each other's lives through different circumstances. I think it's a poignant time to read it now when people can become part of each other's lives on the internet, or because of tragedy, or because of the pandemic. I think this is an interesting time to think about not only familial love and romantic love, but friendship love, and how we need to gather the like-minded people around us and how we need to keep them close and keep them safe. That's a theme that I always like, and a theme in my own life that I enjoy. It was interesting to see it again so starkly in a book that you think of being about monsters. I guess a lot of these gothic novels really had more of that kind of subtext than you remember, but it was fun to read it again. I also do like epistolary novels. I read this one on audio, and in some ways I wish that I had read it physically because I think it's interesting to see how letters are signed or what kind of page breaks people use and how voices are given through different letters and correspondence, diary entries to different characters. So this would be one that I probably will reread again, and if I did, I would think about maybe reading it physically. The next book that I finished in December is A Death in Vienna by Frank Tallis. This is another mystery thriller. It's a historical fiction. It's set in 1902 Vienna, and we are following Dr. Lieberman, who is a psychologist and a follower of Freud. He is working at a hospital mainly geared toward women who have hysteria, and the methods that this hospital employs are not methods that he approves of. They use a lot of shock therapy and electrotherapy, and he thinks that psychoanalysis is how to really help solve people's problems. He is working with a young governess who has developed a paralysis in one of her arms, and although the directors and other doctors think that she needs shock therapy, he disagrees. He's also friends with our other main character, Reinhardt, who is a police detective in the Vienna police, and he's been called upon to investigate a very strange murder. There's been a murder of a spiritualist and a psychic in a seemingly supernatural way. She was found shot in the chest in a locked room, locked from the inside, with seemingly no way for the murderer to escape. Although she obviously suffered a gunshot wound, no bullet or weapon can be found in the locked room. Reinhardt has to wade through our list of suspects, all who seem to believe in supernatural events and psychics, and figure out what may have killed this spiritualist if not a supernatural demonic force. Lieberman and Reinhardt are friends, so they help each other on this investigation, as well as playing music together and singing together, enjoying brandy and cigars together. This was an interesting book because it has a lot of characters and a lot of character development. It's done in a very interesting way in that you don't find out everything about every person right away. You might find out more about a character who's brought up initially much later in the book. I think it was a little bit hard to distinguish between the characters, but ultimately not as hard as some of the other books that I read this month, like And Then There Were None. A Death in Vienna has a lot of descriptions of Vienna, of food, the environment, of the weather, of the architecture, the art of the period, and obviously the author really loves that time period and that place, which is always fun to read from. I do think that it was way too long and a little bit overcomplicated, especially because the mystery kind of wraps up in the last like 50 pages, and it seems like a little bit of a cop-out. There's not really any severe twists to speak of, so it's very much a straightforward mystery. This author is a psychologist himself, and it's obvious that he wants to show off and highlight his profession as well as a time period in his profession that he's really interested in. It did have some interesting conversations about women's place and what women have to suffer through to have autonomy and what they have to suffer through to have things at this time period that were very easily accessible for men, like jobs in the medical profession or education. I enjoyed this book a lot. It was actually surprisingly quick to get through. It's very long, 459 pages, one of the longest books that I've read all year. I thought it would take me longer, but I kind of flew through it. It does have really short chapters, which I enjoy. I like that it was written in that short bursts. I like short chapters. They feel very easy to compel you through the book. As far as how it made me feel, I don't think it particularly made me feel much at all. It was fun. It was pretty fast-paced. It was an interesting time period that I don't read about or think about very often, but other than that, I had no great emotional connection to this book or thought process for this book. I would read the others in the series, but I definitely won't seek them out. The last and 8th book that I read in December was The Fight by Norman Mailer. This is a nonfiction book by Norman Mailer, who both writes nonfiction and fiction, and it is about him going to see a fight between Muhammad Ali and George Foreman in the 70s. This was a real life event, and this fight took place in Africa. So Norman Mailer, who is a great fan of Muhammad Ali, goes to the fight as a reporter, but he does get some extra glimpses into the fight and Muhammad Ali's life in Africa during this time because they are associates of each other. This fight was called the Rumble in the Jungle, and you can see footage from it and you can read more about it. It was a huge event because Muhammad Ali had been banned from fighting for a really long time because he was considered an activist and deserter because he would not fight in the Vietnam War. Muhammad Ali has a super fascinating life, and he was a great civil rights leader. He was one of the early American Muslims, and he's definitely worth learning more about. I don't think that this book particularly told a ton about his life, as it was more about this specific instance and about Norman Mailer, who plays a character in this book as well. He's written himself in the third person in a lot of aspects, which is weird. It's more about his perception of Muhammad Ali, his perception of Muhammad Ali as a fighter and a man, and also his view of this fight, as well as some of the repercussions that this fight had on both the African landscape and the American landscape. I really enjoyed this book. It was very flowery. I would certainly call this, I don't know if it can be considered prose, but I would consider it purple prose, in that Norman Mailer is definitely a flowery, stylistic writer. He is not a straightforward writer. He uses a lot of metaphor and allegories for different things. He also puts his own spin on things because he is writing himself into the story. He's not an objective observer in this. It's an extremely subjective book, but I really enjoyed it. It had a lot of interesting ideas, a lot of them which are outdated now or would be considered inappropriate or problematic. I'm sure that Norman Mailer is probably a problematic writer. He idolizes not only Muhammad Ali and black men in general, but people like Ernest Hemingway, and he sees himself as following the path along those lines. I think this was a difficult nonfiction to read in many ways because it was so flowery and purple and not straightforward at all, but in other ways this might be a book that people really enjoy reading as a nonfiction if you're not used to nonfiction, because it is a little bit more like a novel. Not a straightforward novel either though, so you'd have to be interested also in like weird novels. I started reading this in November for Nonfiction November, and the last like 25% is all about the actual physical boxing match between Foreman and Ali, and it was really hard to get through. So I put it down. I read some of it in December, and then I finished it at the end of December to be my last read of 2021. So in December I read 8 books. Not much diversity in my 8 books, but I was reading mainly for readathons, so I can see why that would happen. I read a lot of mysteries for Cloak and Dagger Christmas and Christie's Missing. They were from all different times, from the 2000s, from the late 1800s, from the Golden Age between the World Wars, another Golden Age mystery, and a mystery from the 90s as well. I read a lot in my comfort zone. I had a reread, I read some nonfiction, I read a ton of mysteries and some Golden Age mysteries. Although I had a reread, I did read a lot of new to me authors. This was my first Dorothy L. Sayers. This was my first time reading Frank Tallis, and I would be interested in dipping into him again if I find it. This was my first time reading Norman Mailer, who, like I said, writes both fiction and nonfiction, and I'd be interested to reading more of his work. And it was my first time reading Jen DeLuca. I read 2 nonfictions if you count the poetry and the actual nonfiction. One very notable thing is that I did not read any books by people of color, which is very sad. Although Dark as a Hazel Eye did have a wide variety of writers, I wouldn't qualify that as a writing by people of color. Some books that I read were extremely white. I read 2 classics. As far as diversity of genres and different things, I did well. As far as diversity of reading diverse authors, reading queer work, books by people of color, reading books about interesting or different subjects to my own background, I didn't really get that done this month. I do think that it was a super fun and cozy reading month and a really nice way to finish out the end of 2021. I look forward in 2022 to reading more varied works all the time. How did you do in your reading month of December? Did you read any favorites? Did you have any rereads? Did you read things inside your comfort zone? Did you read things outside of your comfort zone? Did you feel like it was a good end to 2021? Or do you wish you had read something different? Let me know in the comments below, and I'll see you in the next one. Thanks so much. Bye. I almost forgot. Almost all of these books I have vlogged for BXXKmas 2021 or in other vlogs during the December time period. So I will list those all down below with corresponding like what books I talk about the most in those vlogs. Okay, bye.